At first, there's just you. Your only job is to fulfill your desires and enjoy life. You can't be called selfish, though, because your ego doesn't even exist yet. You're in a perpetual state of oneness, your mind not having yet learned the trick of dividing the oneness into things and beings that seem separate. And you're always in the present moment, your mind not having yet learned the trick of superimposing on the world the purely mental states we call the past and the future. While you're off having fun, you're being protected by a very sophisticated security system whose only job it is to watch after you. It's a mental mechanism named the Default Mode Network, the DMN, that's constantly on the lookout for two things that could do you harm and things that could be of help to you. You haven't learned anything yet, but you didn't enter the world empty-headed either. Besides your awareness and your will, you also entered this world with the capacity to experience joy, love, attraction to beauty, and sensual pleasure in all its myriad forms. The DMN divides the world into separate objects, beings, and events because it has to in order to do its job, which is to take all of the separate bits of sensory information coming in from your five senses and scan them for threats and for resources you can exploit. The DMN brings the threats and resources to your attention, and it filters out everything else so that you're not distracted by useless trivia. It combines the ongoing stream of sensory input with everything that you've learned about the world through experience and weaves it all into a single coherent narrative, your story about the world and your place in it. This is the lens through which you come to view the world. Since the DMN creates your story, I like to refer to it as the storyteller. Your story is an abstraction of the world, within which everything is named, defined, and divided into categories. By the time you're 2 or 3 years old, most of your waking hours are spent perceiving the world through the lens of your story. That is why neuroscientists refer to the storyteller as the default mode network. However, you never lose your ability to experience the world in the raw, unfiltered, holistic way, which requires temporarily shutting down your story through such techniques as meditation and yoga, or as the result of the intoxicating effect of nature, sublime art, spirituality, or sex. As your storyteller constructs your story, it presents it to you in the so-called theater of the mind. Your story includes everyone that plays a role in your life. And of course, the lead role, the hero of your story, is you. But the real you is not in your story. You are the one member of the audience perceiving the story in the theater of the mind. So your storyteller creates an avatar of you, like in a video game where you can see and control one of the avatars on the screen. This avatar of you is your ego, and it consists of all the traits, roles, and beliefs that your storyteller thinks of as defining you. The story presented to you in the theater of the mind is far more captivating than any movie or video game could ever be, because it engages all five senses, and it's all about you. And if you are not mindful, you may mistake the ego for yourself. It is very important to maintain a distance between the real you and your ego. You are not your story. You are not your ego. The voice in your head is not you speaking. It's a mental mechanism called the storyteller. You are the one listening. This type of awareness is called mindfulness. The world had never seen a trait as valuable or as powerful as the storyteller. and it enabled us to become the dominant species, ruling the planet and all its inhabitants. Most other creatures are slaves to strict instincts that force them to behave in specific ways. Think birds flying south for the winter or salmon spawning upstream. But instincts have an inherent drawback, which is that an instinct evolves in a certain environment. And if the creature finds himself in an environment different than the one predicted by the instinct, he's in trouble. Koalas have an instinct to eat eucalyptus leaves. But if a koala finds himself in an environment without eucalyptus trees, such an instinct could prove harmful or even fatal. Humans, on the other hand, have been liberated from the tyranny of strict instincts. Our knowledge about the world is not inborn, it is learned, and we are free to respond to our environment in whatever way we see fit. Evolution lost its ability to force us to behave in a certain way. But in order to retain some level of control, it instilled in us a system of rewards and punishments as a way of coaxing us to behave in a certain way. These rewards and punishments we refer to as emotions. For instance, evolution wants you to have offspring so that your genetic information, your DNA, is passed on to the next generation. So, pairing off with a mate and having a family is rewarded with the good feeling of being in love and being loved, the good feeling of having sex, and the good feeling of having kids. Conversely, if you are without a mate, you are punished with the bad feelings of being lonely, sexually frustrated, and childless. Evolution did not anticipate how knowledgeable we humans would eventually become. And we have now reached the point where we are aware of how and why evolution tries to manipulate us, thus freeing us to outwit evolution's wishes while fulfilling our own wishes. For instance, I got a vasectomy so that I can enjoy love and sex without creating offspring. The takeaway point is this: the more that you understand how and why your brain is put together the way that it is, the more that you can free yourself from being manipulated subconsciously. You happen to be alive at the precise moment in history when we're starting to understand for the first time how the brain works. In the future, people will look back on our time as the moment when humans finally freed themselves from being manipulated subconsciously by evolution. Back in the day, when the mental mechanism called the storyteller first evolved, our species had not yet acquired the capacity for language. Back then, all of the information gathered by the storyteller was acquired through the five senses, and the reliability of this information was extremely high. So high, in fact, that the storyteller regarded all such information as being true. For instance, imagine that you are a member of an early tribe of hunter-gatherers, and one day you see that a family of bears is living in a nearby cave. Good to know. The next day, you discover that on the other side of that hill, there are apple trees bearing ripe apples. This exploitable resource is valuable information too. And because you saw both of these things with your own two eyes, there was certainly no need to question whether that information was true. Much later in the history of our species, we acquired the capacity for language. The enormous benefit of language is that it allows you to gather valuable information about things that you do not personally witness. For instance, a friend might tell you about the family of bears or about the apples, and you can add that information to the ever-expanding knowledge about the world that is contained in your story. Information that we share with each other we refer to as culture. However, the storyteller was designed for information gathered through the five senses. not for information gathered through language. The storyteller performs very poorly when it comes to information it learns through language. The problem is that the storyteller was built to handle the extremely reliable first-hand knowledge that we get through our five senses, and it does a very poor job of handling the extremely unreliable second-hand knowledge of culture, and this can cause a lot of grief. Look at it this way. The invention of language was also the invention of opinions and beliefs, which may or may not be true, as well as the invention of outright lies. Prior to the invention of language, it had been unnecessary for the storyteller to develop a method of sorting truth from untruth. Once language was invented, the storyteller did develop a method for sorting truth from untruth. But this method is of such poor quality that it simply does not work much of the time. And in fact, it's the most harmful and dangerous of all human traits. The result is that your story, everybody's story, is chock full of a bunch of crap that just isn't true. Yet your storyteller presents it to you as if there can be no doubt that it's true. Here's the method the storyteller came up with to tell truth from untruth. It believes everything in his story is true, so when it encounters new information that contradicts anything in your story, the new information is judged to be untrue. There are two big problems with this. The first is that sometimes it happens that part of your story is not true. And if you should find yourself standing face to face with the truth, you will defend the lie within your story. We've all seen situations where someone is passionately defending some ridiculous idea, even when faced with powerful evidence of it being untrue. This is especially harmful with lies that you learn at a very young age, when you soak up everything like a sponge. For instance, imagine a 5-year-old being told repeatedly by his parents that he's an idiot that will never amount to anything. Not knowing any different, he will believe this to be true, and it will become a foundational part of his story, and he may very well carry it with him forever, unless he's lucky enough to take one of Karen's workshops. So the first problem is that once an untruth becomes part of your story, you will believe it's true even when faced with the actual truth. The second problem is that your story not only contains its description of the world, it also contains its description of you, which it uses to construct your ego. And every time you decide to change yourself for the better, your storyteller perceives your behavior as contradicting its description of you. And your storyteller will do everything it can to coax you into getting your behavior back in line with your ego. For instance, I used to be a smoker, and then I decided to quit, which meant that my behavior contradicted my storyteller's definition of who I am. So it tried very hard to get me to go back to being a smoker. One of its many tricks was to give me all the reasons why today would be a terrible day to quit. Tomorrow would be better, and next Tuesday would be better yet. So I used that very trick to fight back. I would agree to remain a smoker, but I just wasn't going to smoke today. And I would repeat this every day. This is why the 12 steps one day at a time has been so successful. After 3 or 4 weeks, my storyteller stopped resisting my decision, and it changed its description of me from smoker to non-smoker. Your storyteller behaves as if the truth it has gathered is a valuable treasure, and your story is a fortress where this valuable treasure is being held for safekeeping, and your storyteller is a guard at the gate, protecting its treasure of truth from being infiltrated and contaminated by anything contradictory, even if that contradictory thing is you. Your storyteller will try to coerce you into never venturing outside the walls of the fortress, your comfort zone. Every time you go outside of your comfort zone, or you even consider going outside of your comfort zone. Your storyteller will try to scare the crap out of you, and it knows just what scares you. It may try to convince you you'll die or you'll go insane, or it may attempt to prevent you from trying something new by convincing you that you'll fail, you're not good enough, and you'd be better off by playing small, by playing it safe. Or it may try to prevent you from being vulnerable and exposing yourself too much by convincing you that if others knew the real truth about you, they will judge you to be weird and unlovable. Your storyteller may even use its strongest, scariest technique, which is to trigger your fight or flight response. The fight or flight response was designed to save you from an actual physical threat to your actual physical self, like if a bear jumps out in front of you. The fight or flight response triggers 15 physical changes, like speeding up your heart and your breathing, pumping adrenaline into your bloodstream, shutting down your immune system, draining the blood out of your brain and digestive system and sending it to your arms and legs, etc. And depending whether you choose flight or you choose fight, you will either be filled with fear and anxiety and a feeling of being less than the threat, or you'll be filled with anger and aggression and a feeling of superiority over the threat. But your storyteller can trigger your fight or flight response even when there's no physical threat to you, just to scare you into staying within your comfort zone. Other times, it triggers the emotional symptoms but not the physical symptoms. For instance, if you hate public speaking, your storyteller will include that as a part of its description of you, and if you are required to make such a speech, your storyteller may trigger your fight or flight response. This is a really dirty trick. Ironically, you may do a crappy job of doing the speech only because your stupid fight or flight response has been triggered. Actually, the entire storyteller mechanism is modeled on the fight or flight response. That is why it is so common for your storyteller to either make you feel inferior to others or to make you feel superior to others. I saw this posted on Facebook. The antidote to this is to shift away from your story viewpoint towards the holistic, empathetic viewpoint of your authentic self. You will see past any superficial differences and perceive others as being essentially like you, instilling a feeling of connectedness and belonging. When you catch your storyteller trying to manipulate you, there are proven techniques for fighting back. All right, tip number 1. If the fight or flight response emotions have been triggered, with or without the 15 physical symptoms, look around you. Do you see a bear or some similar physical threat? If you do, your feelings are legitimate and justified. More often, you will not see a bear, in which case you will know that it's just your storyteller trying to manipulate you and there's no real threat. Realizing this is very empowering. Horror films are so popular because it's fun and exhilarating to be scared when it's all make-believe. Well, when the storyteller scares you, it's all make-believe too. A good example of this is when you replay a traumatic memory in your head and you feel fear. Fear might have been totally legitimate and justified during the original event, but feeling the same fear while watching a replay of the event in your theater of the mind is just your storyteller scaring you unnecessarily. Another example is vulnerability. Think of how you feel when someone drops their defenses and removes their armor and shares their deepest, truest, most authentic self with you. You love that person more than ever, right? You're more connected than ever, right? Vulnerability is the most attractive human trait. Well, in other people. For me to be vulnerable is horrifying. But when I feel that fear, I look around. No bears in sight. It's just my storyteller trying to coax me into staying inside the fortress walls, inside my comfort zone. And if I allow fear to imprison me within my comfort zone, I am rewarded with a feeling of safety. Abraham Maslow understood this. In any given moment, we have two options: to step forward into growth or to step back into safety. And Brene Brown understands this. I think we should be born with a warning label similar to the ones that come on cigarette packages. Caution. If you trade in your authenticity for safety, you may experience the following: anxiety, depression, eating disorders, addiction, rage, blame, resentment, and inexplicable grief. And be mindful that it isn't actually any safer within your comfort zone than outside your comfort zone. And there's a way to shut down the fight or flight response. When humankind first learned how to speak, it involved learning breath control. And you now have the power to willfully take deep, slow, full breaths, even if your fight or flight response has been triggered. Deep, slow, full breaths trigger the fight or flight response into perceiving that if you're breathing that way, there must not be a threat, and it shuts down. You may also use such breathing techniques as a preemptive strike if you suspect your storyteller might be about to trigger your fight or flight response, as when you meditate or do yoga, both of which can shut down your story. And of course, your storyteller sees that as a threat. Tip number 2. Your storyteller would have no need to scare you or make you feel small if it was able to simply make you do something, but it can never make you do anything. For the ability to will an action is entirely under the control of your authentic self. The ultimate technique for quitting smoking is this: don't put any cigarettes in your mouth. I know, it's funny, right? But it's profound too. Your storyteller can chatter away in your ear, and it can make certain thoughts and feelings arise in you, but when it comes to actually doing something, only you can make that happen. Think about it. If your storyteller could put a cigarette in your mouth and light it, it wouldn't mess around with trying to coax you into doing it. The ancient Toltec wisdom perceived the human mind as having a dual nature. On one side is your story, which they called the bubble of perception. And on the other side is your authentic self, which they summed up with one word: will. Modern neuroscience has proven this to be true, having found that every time you will an action, the DMN, the storyteller, is momentarily shut down. The takeaway point is this: you do not have total control over which thoughts and feelings float into your head, but you always have total control over which ones you buy into, and you always have total control over what you do. Okay, tip number 3 is the third and last tip on doing battle with your storyteller. And it's truly life-altering, so fasten your seatbelt. Your storyteller considers everything in your story to be true, but you are under no obligation to do the same. So stop it. Just stop it. I'm not saying that you should consider everything you know to be a lie, but when your story is butting heads up against reality, you might want to question whether your truth is really true. The greatest living philosopher, no, not me, Byron Katie Mitchell. She has a very simple technique that consists of just 4 questions that you ask of any thought that is causing you to suffer. Is it true? Can you absolutely know that it's true? How do you feel when you believe that thought? And who would you be without that thought? With practice, you will arrive at the point where your storyteller will float some kind of self-limiting thought, and your immediate response will be to question whether that thought is really true. You don't have to question every thought. just the ones that contradict reality. And those are easy to spot because all thoughts that contradict reality have one thing in common: they cause you to suffer. For instance, you might wake one morning to find it's raining, and it's on a day when you were planning on having a picnic in the park. Your response might be to get angry and upset for being cheated out of your sunny day. The thought causing your unpleasant feelings is, it was supposed to be a sunny day. Meanwhile, the reality of the situation is that it's raining. When faced with such a contradiction, your storyteller will always take the side of your story. But you are free to choose which side you take, and you will find that you're a lot happier when you take the side of reality. This is not only true with external reality, but also with internal reality. Whenever your authentic self contradicts your storyteller's description of you, your ego, the storyteller will always take the side of your ego. But you are under no obligation to do the same. You are free to choose which side you take, and you will find that you're a lot happier when you take the side of reality. That is, when you take the side of your authentic self. The final topic I want to discuss is trauma. You experience an event as traumatic when the event is so contradictory to the foundation of your story that your storyteller is unable to weave it into the cohesive narrative of your story. In the most extreme cases, the storyteller's coping mechanism is to repress the memory altogether. That is, the storyteller hides the traumatic event from you. More typically, your storyteller is unable to hide it from you, but it will still do everything it can to keep it hidden from the public. And if you even consider sharing it with others, it will flood you with a very unpleasant feeling, specifically designed to manipulate you into not sharing that secret. This special secret-keeping emotion is what we refer to as shame. This feeling is not a judgment on the traumatic event itself. It's not even a judgment on you, although it can feel that way. It's a judgment that the traumatic event contradicts your story, and thus must remain hidden from others. Put another way, the storyteller always uses feelings to control your future behavior. In this case, the feeling of shame is used to prevent you from sharing the secret. It certainly is not trying to prevent you from repeating the event. You have no desire to repeat the event. The worst part of this is that as long as you let the feeling of shame prevent you from sharing the secret, you're unable to be authentic. The bad news is that your storyteller is unable to incorporate the trauma into your story. But the good news is that it wishes it could. It's stuck and it needs your help. So there are two things you must do. The first thing is that you must do what the storyteller failed to do. You must write a story about the traumatic event. There is nothing so dark that we cannot put it on paper, question it, and set ourselves free. You have to push through the feeling of shame and give your trauma story a voice. It is essential that you do not spin your trauma story in ways that you believe will be more acceptable to others, which would defeat the whole purpose of authentically sharing. Be careful that your trauma story does not include any self-limiting beliefs that are not true. For instance, if you were traumatized by your parents divorcing when you were a child, and you blamed yourself for their divorce, you must not include this belief as part of your trauma story, for it's not true. If you wish, you may include that at the time of the event you blamed yourself, but then you must also include that today you can see that you were mistaken. I recommend that everything you express in your trauma story must pass Katie's 4 questions. The second thing you must do is just as essential. After writing your trauma story, you must share it with others. Once others acknowledge that your trauma story is indeed true, then it can become part of your overall story. At the moment that your storyteller incorporates your trauma story into your overall story, the storyteller has no further need to try to keep the trauma a secret, and so it stops trying to manipulate you by making you feel shame. The shame associated with the trauma starts to dissipate. With severe trauma, you may need to share your trauma story more than once. But each time the shame will have less and less power to manipulate you, and eventually the shame will evaporate. I want to give you another great quote from Brene Brown, the only human being to ever dedicate their life to the study of shame. Vulnerability is the core of shame and fear and our struggle for worthiness. But it appears that it's also the birthplace of joy, of creativity, of belonging, of love. Obviously, when you get vulnerable, you must choose your audience carefully. I recommend against jumping on stage at a Donald Trump rally and telling your trauma story. The main quality that you should look for when selecting an audience is people who are themselves striving for authenticity. That would include everyone taking Karen's trauma workshop. When you are deciding who to tell that is not in such a workshop, confirm that the person is loving, empathetic, and they value vulnerability. When you tell such a person, you will have nothing to fear and nothing to be ashamed of.